Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Great to have a chance to be able to chat with you. I just wanted to give you my little disclaimer, and that is I'm hoping that you can hear me pretty well, and I'm also more than happy to take questions or have a conversation with you all at any time. I do have some content that I want to make sure I get through that Melissa and Amanda and others asked me to cover, but feel free to send questions, comments into the chat, and they'll pass them on to me. We'll cover them every 2 or 3 times during the next hour or so. I want you to know that it's almost my bedtime here on the East Coast. It's 6 o'clock, so I know that some of you are right in the middle of your afternoon. I'll try to make sure that I kind of pay attention to the time. And so let's get started if that's okay with everyone. I'm assuming you can hear me okay, and unless I see something in the chat, I'll assume that everything's going okay. So as I was kind of introduced, I am George Sugai. I'm at the University of Connecticut, where I've been since 2005. And what's most important, I think, about this, my being on this call, this webinar, is that I was at the University of Oregon between 1984 and 2004 or 2005 or so, and had a fantastic experience at the University of Oregon, got to know Anne Glang and others who are part of this particular project. And so we have a long history of going back around our professional careers. You should know that probably about 7 or 8 years ago, my wife and I entered into the TBI world because of our daughter had a car accident. And so became much more interested in what the TBI world looks like and how kids with disabilities, kids with behavior challenges, and so forth are supported within that community. And this particular group, CBIRT, has been really wonderful in supporting not only our family, but other families who have had needs around traumatic brain injuries. So I just want to acknowledge them as we go through this. So let me get started and just to kind of share with you that what I was asked to do is do a couple things. One is describe a little bit about what our positive behavioral intervention supports work is about, just to make sure we're all on the same page about that. Many of you probably know about it already. Second thing I was asked to do is kind of have us think about how behavior challenges and so forth is kind of considered or thought about or addressed within not only the disabilities world in general, but the TBI world specifically. And so I'll kind of address some of those topics as well. It's my understanding that some of you are school psychologists, some of you are speech and language, some of you are in the medical community. So there's a wide range of individuals who are on this call. So I'll do my best to try to make sure I meet your needs. And those of you who may have been part of the PBIS world already may find some of this content a little bit redundant, so you can check your emails while I'm presenting on that content. But the goal here is to give you an idea about how this content can relate to what's going on within CBIRT and your own particular work. I'm hoping you can see a little PowerPoint that I've got up, and I'm going to use a few slides to kind of guide my conversation with you. I've also made sure that a PDF of those materials are available, not only at the PBIS.org site, but I also sent some to Amanda and Melissa so they also have a copy if you're interested. So you don't really need to take notes unless you're OCD and want to, but my goal here is to kind of cover some big ideas. So let me just do a quick check. Melissa, Amanda, am I coming across okay?
Yes, George, I can hear you just fine.
Perfect. And have I said anything that's not true yet?
Oh, you are totally on par. You're doing good.
Okay, good.
Thanks.
So let's move forward here. And as I said, I'm going to do 3 or 4 things in particular, and then I'll try to do some examples and give time for some questions and discussion. I really wanted to discuss a little bit about how we think about supporting kids with behavior difficulties within what we like to call sort of a continuum of behavior support. And I want to kind of talk about individuals with behavioral difficulties in the context of all children who might be in a particular classroom or community or setting or what have you. I want to do a really brief history and context for PBIS, and then I'll try to hit on some big ideas about how PBIS and something that's now being called multi-tiered systems relates to this particular conversation. Every once in a while, you'll see a little hand clapping on the left-hand side, and that's sort of a cue to me and to you that something important is happening. That is, it's something that you kind of want to try to remember as we go through the materials. It's also a signal to kind of wake up, and if you're taking notes, this is a good place to take some notes. As I always like to do, I want to make sure that you need to know that I am directly involved with the PBIS Center, which is a federally funded center. But a lot of the work that I do is really been because of the work of others. People like Siebert, researchers and practitioners, school psychologists, trainers, researchers, school personnel, and so forth. A lot of what I do and what I'm sharing with you, we've learned from working directly with families, adults, children, and youth as well. And I really have been, it's been very helpful to work with Amanda, Melissa, and others at the Siebert Center in trying to get this thing set up. So I just want to acknowledge that particular group. As always, it's kind of hard to run webinars, but some of this may or may not make sense to you just because it's something I always put up there. But I'm hoping that you feel free to ask questions, make comments. I know that I won't be able to address all your questions and all your needs, but I'm hoping that you'll be able to kind of generalize some of the things I'm saying to your particular context. I can't see you, so you can get up and move around. That's great. You can stand, you can do some yoga if you wish, but try to make yourself feel comfortable, and we'll kind of go from there. Okay, so you have a homework task, and the homework task is something for you to think about as we go through the rest of the content. And at the end of the next 50 minutes or so, my goal is to make sure that you at least remember or learn one thing that you can make a note for and try to do next week. I always like you to kind of think about something that you can actually do and something that you can take away with you into your job. So as we go through the next 50 minutes or so, please take note of some things that are important to you and think about how you might apply them to your work routine on Monday. So that leads to your homework task. Move this forward if I can. So I'm going to start out with some of the questions I want to try to answer. And by the end, I'm hoping to be able to give you information so you can answer the following questions. First of all, what is PBIS and how does it relate to MTSS and multi-tiered systems? Second of all, I want you to understand that I am a special educator. I have worked, that's what my life has been about, is working with kids with disabilities and kids with behavior challenges in particular. But one thing I've learned is that it's really important to work with all kids, and I want to describe for you how positive behavioral support is useful for everyone, but in particular for those kids who might have particular challenges. I'm going to leave you with the core features of what PBIS is, and then I'm going to hopefully give you some content so you can advocate and take your role as school psychologist or social worker or counselor or PTOT and think about how you can affect policy to improve your ability to implement and provide supports. And then lastly, I'm just going to leave you with some ideas about hopefully how you can kind of support each other in the kind of work that we do. All right, so let me move on, and I'm going to do a little bit of two things. I'm going to try to give you some content to know about, and I think it's important for me to emphasize that I love it that people know something, and I love it that people learn something, but what's really more important to me is what you do with it. And I'm going to focus on the doing part of PBS and what are some things that we as individuals can do to support kids and families who might have behavioral difficulties in whatever context they might be in. To expand that particular picture, what I'd like you to think about is that what's most important to me is the kid, the adult, the youth, the family side of the logic model. That is, it's really important that we think about what are the quality outcomes that benefit the student and all those around the student or the individual. I think we sometimes make decisions that don't keep the kid outcome in mind, and I think that's what's really important about special ed and some of the work we do in the world of disabilities. I also want you to keep in mind that, you know, we have to learn things and we have to do things in order for that to work. And that's coming back to that do kind of logic. And it's pretty important to think that we bring those two together, because it's hard to do something if you haven't learned it. It's hard to kind of learn something if we don't take advantage of our experiences. And when you put all that together, hand clap if you will, wake up your neighbors, something important is happening. I'm hoping that you walk away with the idea that PBIS, positive behavioral supports, multi-tiered systems, those kinds of frameworks are something that we can really conceptually defend at the end of this 45 minutes anyway, that it's clearly linked to evidence-based practices on the do side, that outcomes are clearly important to what we do, and that implementation fidelity is probably one of the most important things I spend most of my time on right now, which is how do the adults use those evidence-based practices. And then even more lately, I've been focusing quite a bit on policy and legislation and so forth, and how we can make sure that we go to scale with what we consider best practice. So the do and the learn side has a lot to do with those 5 particular items. And the more that we are fluent with those 5 items, the better I think we're going to be able to do the do side. Okay, so this is something that we've stolen from Dean Fixon and Karen Blasi, and they were at the National Implementation Research Network and also at the University of North Carolina. And one of the most useful things out of many things they've given us is this particular picture. And when we started the PBIS Center way back in the 1990s, we focused very much on the left-hand side, which is what are the most important practices and what are the ones that we want to kind of stay away from. And since then, we've been focusing more on the top side of that table, which is the implementation side. And we've been trying to look at those two combined, because we can deliver effective practices, but if we don't implement them well, we don't produce the kind of outcomes that we want. And the goal, of course, is to use the most effective intervention that is culturally adapted to the context and then implemented with the greatest degree of fidelity and durability, which is that one cell to the top left. And the goal is to stay away from the other 3. And I just want to highlight a little bit about what those other 3 look like. And there's some pictures on the screen right now just to kind of illustrate what we mean by an effective practice, which is a fitness center, ineffectively being implemented with people going up the escalator to get to the fitness center. Another example would be a sign on a door that says enter only and do not enter. We know that doors are effective, but they're not going to be effective if we don't implement them well or put up signs to make them work well. And pardon me for using this example, but I need to use one more to kind of illustrate this. And here's a sign, or actually a card, that says, has a condom staple to it, and it says, please practice safe sex. Well, the problem is that the staple is right in the middle of the packaging. And many of the interventions that we use in schools are effective interventions, but we sometimes don't implement them very well or present them incompletely, and we don't produce the maximum outcomes that are most important. The other bottom cells at the bottom are still present in our schools and some of our therapy settings, and I want to make sure we make mention of those. And for example, it's hard to find examples that fit into this sample that are pictures, but this one sort of works. And it shows a sign. It says, please do not throw stones to this sign. And the question, of course, is, why do you need the sign? And of course, if you look carefully, there are little nick marks on it from stones being thrown at it. So it's not being implemented very well. And so it kind of fits into that bottom category down there. I found another one of those signs. This one is made out of metal. And this figured that they might make it more effective if they made it out of metal. But the problem is, of course, is it's still the same content. Please do not throw stones at this sign. And if you look carefully, there are bullet holes in this particular sign. So it's kind of a problematic kind of example of an intervention that doesn't fit into the top left-hand side. And the last one, of course, is one that you've probably seen around on the social media sites, but it's a really good example of an ineffective practice that is being poorly implemented. And if you can't read it very well, it says psychic failure canceled due to unforeseen circumstances. And we have an intervention that's being promoted as being something effective, but at the same time isn't being implemented very well. And again, I'm sort of making fun of this whole kind of picture of implementation fidelity, but I think it's pretty important that we kind of pay attention to it as we go through the content. So to give you a context for this, our PBIS Center was started in 1996-97 with the reauthorization of IDA. And we set out to pick the most effective interventions, and we tried to establish an implementation framework that would maximize the fidelity of those effective practices. When the federal government gave us our money for this center, they said, just collect all the evidence-based practices. And one thing we learned from the implementation folks is that you also have to give at least as much attention to the implementation side. So the PBIS Center has really evolved over the last 20 years to really focus on the implementation component. And if you're interested in that particular topic, I encourage you to go to the site. We just got refunded at the end of 2018, so we have another 5-year cycle of support, and we're hoping to be able to kind of carry forward that work in some areas that I'll be mentioning to you in a second. The whole center started out with a focus on 4 critical areas, and as I mentioned before, kid outcomes is the most important thing to me. So I really do spend quite a bit of our time in that big circle about kid outcomes. And it really is about arranging environments for those outcomes to be successfully achieved. And we achieve them through paying attention to evidence-based practices, using data for decision making, and making sure the systems are in place. And one of the best ways to think about this is that the systems are the support that the adults need to have to do their work. So that's coaching, that's training, that's administrative leadership, that's professional development, that's evaluation. Those are all things that make it possible for us to be able to deliver those evidence-based practices. And the practices are what the students experience. And the reason I like this picture is because we kind of put it together back in 1996 as a way to organize our understanding of how those 4 parts fit together. And 21 years later, it's still with us, and we use it quite frequently. And it's something that really guides our problem-solving model for how we do our work. So I encourage you to think about those, because we basically stole those from other disciplines that use that same kind of logic. If you go to the doctor to have essentially an operation being done, having heart surgery or whatever, you want to know what the outcomes of a particular procedure might look like. You want to make sure the data are there to guide your decisions about doing it or not. You want to know what interventions are going to be used or procedures will be used to do the surgery. And of course, you want to know how competent the surgical staff is in being able to use those practices. And if you're a special educator like me, the same 4 elements are part of the IEP process. We look at data for current level of functioning. We write short and long-term goals and objectives, which are the outcomes. We select interventions or practices based on those outcomes and data. And then we write it up, and we try to provide supports for the adults, special educators, special ed teams to be able to implement those practices. So the reason I'm spending a little bit of time on this is because PBIS is really about balancing the relationship between those 4 elements. All right, so a little background conceptually. Remember I said conceptual logic is one of the more important kind of features of what we do. I just want you to have a clear understanding that PBIS, bottom right-hand side, sort of evolved out of the perspective that the center had around the use of the scientific method as a way of solving problems. We use sort of the behavioral logic as a way to organize those scientific methods. We use the applied behavioral analytic technology as the tool. And we've used the positive behavioral support logic from the development disability world to kind of validate the social and sort of the social, emotional, and validation of what the parents, families, clients, students themselves perceive or experience when the intervention is being implemented. And the PBS stuff is frankly just a framework that we use to kind of deliver those interventions. And I'll come back to that in a second. But I wanted you to have at least one picture that you can reference back to that showed you where the PBIS and the conceptual foundations came from. Did not come out of a psychoanalytic model or psychoeducational model, did not come out of a cognitive model, did not come out of a medical model. It clearly came out of a kind of a cognitive behavioral kind of evolution. And I wanted you to kind of understand that as we move this forward. So again, backtrack. I'm trying to give you a little bit of conceptual background for where we're at. I wanted to focus on how important it is to look beyond just the interventions and pay attention to the outcomes, practices, systems, and data that we use. I want you to know that most of the work I do now as a special educator is really about kind of organizing systems, or the schools or the institutions or the group homes or the therapy facilities that we work in, because those organizations are the places where the interventions have to be implemented. And that's really the systems part of it. And what we've learned is that successful organizations have 4 critical features. Clear vision, common vision about where they're going, common language, how they do business, common set of experiences or routines for getting that business done, and then quality leadership. And if I think about successful organizations like CBERT, like PBIS Center, like Google, like Apple, like Amazon, those organizations have those 4 critical features: a common vision, common language, common experience, and common leadership. So the work we do in the PBIS Center is about creating classrooms with 30 kids in them, so there's a common vision, a common language, common experience of routine, and quality leadership on the part of the teachers. And the school-wide work that we do is really about making sure the principal and his or her leadership team have their acts together to provide an environment where experiences and routines for all kids and all staff in a building have a common language and a common vision. So the organizational logic is really part of what the PBIS component is really focused on. Now, I'm hoping for those of you that are sort of new to the PBIS world, that you're realizing that PBIS isn't this intervention. It's not a practice. It's not a social skills curriculum. It really is this organizational kind of set of principles that allow us to deliver evidence-based practices so they have their maximum benefit or maximum effect. We've learned that if effective systems produce outcomes that are good for the adults in those systems, which then can be good for the students in those environments. And if it's done well, we've created this new thing called school climate, which has become very prevalent in the current school environments. And we find that positive school climates clearly have those 4 characteristics: common vision, common language, common experience routine, and quality leadership, which all have sort of a positive valence around them. So I'm going to stop in about 2 minutes. So if you have questions, you might send them on, and then I will stop to make sure everything's going okay. But before I throw it out for questions, I just want to kind of transition with this picture. And you'll notice that so far I've been presenting pretty much about outcomes, data, practices, and systems in a fairly kind of neutral way. I want you to think about what we do with those outcomes, data, and practices and systems, and our own experiences with them affects delivery of them. So let me just go off task for a second and show you this picture. And you don't need to write it into the chat box. In fact, I would encourage you not to. I'm going to ask you a question, and I just want you to think of the answer, or you can write it down wherever you are. But I want you to think about what the answer is to the following question. And that is, what state was this picture taken in? And to answer that question, what I'd like to give you is a context for it. And you need to know about 8 or 9 years ago, my son, who's in that picture on the left-hand left side there, he and I did a cross-country bicycle ride from Oregon to Washington, D.C. We went through about 20 states on our bicycle, and in one of those states, we stopped. And we stopped to take a break, and my son saw this sign, and he said, "How far away is the wood?" And I had to say to him, "Nope, son, it isn't how far away the wood is. They have firewood for sale." They got firewood, and it's like kind of got milk. And, you know, my son was born in Eugene, Oregon. He's a Portlandia kid. He's been further, at that time, had been further east of Cascades. So, you know, this experience to him was something new, and he interpreted that sign based on his learning experience. So going back to where we started, what question, what state is this picture taken? And the answer for that is Maryland. Now, the reason I like to show this picture is because what we've learned, and when we use it, is that we get a range of responses. And oftentimes Maryland is surprising to many people who see this picture or are unfamiliar with it. Oftentimes the answer is Alabama, it's Idaho, it's Eastern Oregon, it's Nebraska, it's whatever. And what's interesting about that is, all of us that are viewing this picture and answering that question have a learning experience, just like my son did. And that learning experience, be it school, be it family, be it neighborhood, be it whatever, affects how we view the world, the kinds of things we experience. And I want to suggest that that learning experience, that context, that cultural experience affects how we interpret what kids do, and also what kind of interventions we select. So to show you what I mean by that, I want to have you take a look at this setting. And in this picture, you'll see that there's a principal sitting in his office, and there are 3 kids sitting on the bench. Well, one student has used the SHIT word in school, second kid has said the F-U-C-K word in the classroom. And the third kid has said Christmas in class. All three have been sent to the office for talking out in class. And the question is, why have those kids been sent? Why has the kid been sent for using the SHIT word? Or why has the kid been sent to the office for using Christmas? And I want to suggest that, the teacher's learning experience, his or her tolerance, his or her experience with that particular student and so forth affects the likelihood of the kid being sent to the office. So an office discipline referral is not just about the kid. Yeah, the kid engaged in the behavior, but the teacher has to make a decision about how severe or intense that behavior is. The principal has to make a decision about how he or she responds to that particular behavior. And the parent, family, and others have to decide how they're going to respond to the particular consequence that's being delivered and what the student has done. Each one of those decision points reflects a different learning history and cultural experience. Why is this important? Because if you are a kid sitting in that middle and you use the F word and you happen to be a boy and you happen to be Black, and you happen to have a disability, there's a 6 to 8 times greater likelihood of sitting on that bench. So using the same word, but having those characteristics of being a male, being Black, and having a disability, you're increased likelihood to be sitting on that bench. Now, is that the kid's issue? Is that the teacher issue? Is that the school issue? Probably all of those combined. But the fact of the matter is there's some disparities going on in that particular picture. And as we go forward with this, I'm going to suggest to you that whenever we have a problem behavior, challenging behavior, we have a subjective response to that. We make a decision based on our own experiences with practices, interventions, and that behavior in the past. And oftentimes, our decisions are influenced by that learning history. And I'm hoping that as we go through the rest of the content, you'll keep that in mind because the cultural part of it's a big deal. And if you get a chance, you might take a look at this YouTube. It's a brief one. It's about 7 or 8 minutes long. TED Talk, I believe. And Rosemary Allen does a wonderful job of describing how school suspensions or discipline consequences are related to what the adults do. So I'm not going to use time during the webinar to show that, but I'd encourage you to take a look at it if you haven't already. So let me stop there before I go on and kind of finish out with a little bit more about what PBIS is and ask if there are any questions. And I'll turn that over to you, to Amanda or Melissa, to kind of guide me to how to answer or how to find them. So I'm not hearing anything, so I don't know what that means.
It doesn't look like anyone has written anything into chat yet.
Okay.
If anyone has questions or answers here, go ahead and put that in your chat box to your right-hand side of your screen.
I'm happy without them as well. Okay.
Okay.
If you have, if I'm going too quickly, if I'm not going fast enough, you can put those in there as well. I'm happy to respond. So I'm just going to move on, and then I'll let Amanda or Melissa interrupt if they have questions that pop up. Fair enough?
Sounds good.
Okay, here we go. So a little bit about what we mean by this notion of culture and climate, and then a little bit more on the PBIS side, and then I'm going to focus more specifically on how we think about challenging behavior. I've been doing this work now since about 1974, actually before a lot of you were even born that are on this call. But even having done this for 21 years in the PBIS Center, one thing we find is that many of the same kinds of challenges that we found 21 years ago are still present. And these are the kind of things that keep me up at night. And what we're finding is that we still need to maintain a fair amount of careful attention to what we mean by evidence-based practices, implementation of fidelity, use of data for decision-making, and so forth. I spend all my time focusing on school environments. I think schools are one of our most important social change agents. Kids spend 12 years of their lives in public schools, sometimes private schools as well. They have 180 days or plus or minus within those schools each year, and they have 6 hours a day with pretty significant adults. And the reason I bring this up is because these are places where adults can have a pretty significant impact on not only preventing the development of problem behavior, but also being able to respond to them in ways that can be constructive and supportive of the students who might have those particular challenges. These are places where kids with disabilities can have their individual needs met. These are places where kids that are talented and gifted can have opportunities to expand their skills. These are places where kids who have mental health issues can feel supported and cared for. They're pretty important places for us to invest in. And I like to think of them as a good place to think about the PBIS framework work. All right, so a little bit of quick data just from an IES or NCES database. And I just want to kind of summarize this very quickly because there are two big ideas that come out of this database that are relevant to the work that we do, and I'm hoping that you'll walk away with as you think about your work next Monday. Every year there's a survey that's done. It's published 2 or 3 years kind of late, if you will, but kids across the country, and this is one sample of the data set for our kids 12 to 18 years old. And I'm not going to go through the details of how they got the data. You can kind of look that up yourself. But I just want to share with you some of two of the major outcomes. And one of them, which is particularly relevant in our current day and age and the kinds of things going on in our schools and communities, is that regardless of the perception of crime, that is, I feel like it's a high crime or low crime neighborhood, most kids feel safe at school. School is one place that is a safe haven for students, regardless of what the neighborhood feels like or sounds like or actually is. Now, I want you to be careful. These data only go up to 2015, so we don't know if that's still true, up from 2016 and on. But we know that schools are pretty significant places, and 95% of kids generally view those schools as being a safe place to be. I also want you to know, which is why we on this call are so important to this effort, is that kids are more likely to feel safe at school, in that 90% of kids who say they do, if they have access to an adult or student. And what that leads us to is that adult relationships that are supportive and caring and safe, that are respectful, increase the likelihood of a kid perceiving the environment as being safe. And if you're a therapist, if you're a school counselor, if you're a general ed teacher, if you're a school administrator, we are the adults in those school environments where kids depend upon having access in order to have their needs met and to be able to report on things that are bothering them and so forth. And so I think it's really important you think about how school climate, PBIS work, the work that you do with students is really about building that initial handshake with kids so the relationship's established, because without that relationship, the interventions that we have in place with school environments aren't going to be perceived as being safe places. And learning, which is the ultimate goal of most of our schools, is not likely to be maximized. So one, schools are a great place. Most kids feel that they're safe. And second of all, that adult relationships are a significant variable in achieving that. One more piece of data from that report, and that is that from 2007 to 2015, the rates of bullying have gone down. We don't know if that's still true post-2016, however. Actually, we do have a little bit of data from some other reports which we'll come back to. But in general, bullying has been going down at least between 2007 and 2015. There are some data from the FBI database and also from juvenile justice areas that indicate that bullying is actually on the rise since 2016. But the data that we have from this particular database indicates that it's on the decrease. What's important about this is that kids are more likely to report less bullying if they have a relationship with an adult. So the adult relationship component becomes a critical variable again in thinking about how kids feel safe at school and the degree to which they report being bullied or being victimized. So the previous data talked about adult relationships as being important. Adult relationships as being important is important also in having kids feel like they have a response if a school has significant highly rates of bullying, harassment, teasing, and so forth within the school. Now again, the data aren't as compelling after 2016. And again, we're finding that bullying rates have actually increased in some of our schools since 2016. All right, so one more little kind of background piece, and I'll shift over to the PBIS component. And that is, I want you to make sure you understand that the PBIS effort is really all about prevention, and I'm going to kind of illustrate to you why prevention is such a big deal. I know many of you on this call work with individuals who already have some behavior difficulties, or already have a disability, or already have something that causes them some challenges in moving through their environments. I still think, and the data are pretty clear, that it's still a prevention problem. And what I mean by that is we can do things to prevent already occurring problem behaviors from occurring in the future. And that's still a prevention-based problem. But it's really important that we think about what the risk and protective factors are that are associated with that risk. And I'm going to briefly kind of illustrate what we mean by that. Now, as a preface to this, I want to give a little kind of clap, if you will, or a little bit of a kudos to Tony Bigland for a book that he published way back in 2015. And it's a wonderful book. I know some of you probably read it already. Did a great job of talking about how important prevention is in our everyday lives, in our schools, in mental health, in disability world, special ed, and so forth. And he does it with sort of everyday language, and he covers the whole range of disciplines. And I strongly encourage you to take a look at it, just because he does such a good job of describing the importance of evidence-based practices for one, but more importantly, the importance of focusing on prevention. So I encourage you to take a look at that, and it'll make the rest of this kind of this next 5 or 6 slides even more meaningful. When the PBIS Center got started in 1996, Hill Walker kind of influenced. Hill Walker's at the University of Oregon. He's one of my mentors. He kind of helped us understand a little bit about the importance of risk factors and protective factors. And he was focusing on kids with antisocial behaviors. And what we chose to do is take that particular logic and apply it in a way that kind of looks like this. And in our school rules, we basically said, you know what? Kids have risk. They come to school with certain parts of their histories, certain parts of who they are that make it more difficult for them to succeed at school. And I want you to note that these are only examples. You can change the content any way you want to. In some cases, not always, sometimes TBI is one of those risk factors that kids bring to the learning environment, bring to a session that increases their likelihood of having difficulty. So being aware of those risk factors is important. And what we can do is put in place protective factors. Those protective factors are things that that can be sort of boosters, or we can kind of vaccinate the kid against the impact of those risk factors. Academic success, teaching social skills, teaching self-management skills, those are all very important protective factors in handling most risk factors that are relatively minor. Unfortunately, stuff happens inside our schools, within the individuals, within our families. Trauma occurs. In the example of my daughter, when she was 21, she was involved in a car accident. That particular trauma had a big impact on her particular life. So the TBI condition became much more of a risk for her. Inside our schools, we have issues around gun violence. We have kids who commit suicide or threaten suicide. We have teachers who have medical conditions and die inside of schools. We have rabid dogs. We have all kinds of stuff that occurs. And those risk enhancers make it even more difficult for kids who have risk factors. And these protective factors on the right-hand side are sufficient, or are necessary, but insufficient to be able to handle those. Unfortunately, when significant events happen inside of schools, like mass murders, like major fires, we sometimes respond in ways that are trying to be helpful, but oftentimes are ineffective. And a lot of the work that we do has been to try to avoid those things on the left-hand side in our PBIS world and try to get people to focus on the things on the right-hand side. Because we want to make sure that when a school has experienced significant trauma, that they fall back on those things that they know are effective in being able to support the kids and their adults in their environments, and to make sure that all individuals in those environments, kids, faculty, family, and so forth, are being supported. To give you kind of a narrow set of examples, the PBIS Center has been providing support to places like Sandy Hook School District, also to Parkland. And what we've learned is that, the initial response after a traumatic event like that is in fact a very, trying to make things better, trying to make sure we go through the grieving process and so forth. And sometimes decisions are made that oftentimes are not productive in the long or short term. And so it's really important to kind of pay attention to those things that we know can be pretty important. And that's where the trauma-informed interventions come into play, mental health first aid and so forth. So keeping those evidence-based effective responses in place and creating frameworks and structures to be able to deliver those becomes pretty important. And what I'm trying to make a case for, where we're getting up to, is that the PBIS framework is one of those tiered systems that allow us to be able to organize our response. I'm going to skip by this because of time. All right, so what is PBIS? First thing I want you to think about is that PBIS is nothing special, just 4 little letters that were given to us in 1996 when we formed the center. And really what we did is created this organizational framework that helped us build a continuum of support that was populated with evidence-based practices that provided academic and behavior support for all kids. The most important thing I want you to remember on this call is that PBIS is a framework and it's not an intervention. Probably weekly, we get phone calls at our center, emails, texts, whatever, that say something like the following: I've got this kid, he's in my classroom, and he kicks me in the ankle on a daily basis. Would you please help me PBIS him, please? And we have to continue to remind people that PBIS is not an ankle kicking intervention, that instead it's this problem-solving framework that allows teachers, educators, school psychologists, counselors, and others to be able to come up with the best interventions possible to support those kids in preventing that ankle kicking from occurring in the future. And it's done in the context of classroom-wide and school-wide interventions. So if you remember nothing else, please remember that PBIS is this organizational framework, this problem-solving process by which we organize our interventions to make our best data-based decisions. And again, I'm going back to that outcomes data, practice, and systems logic that we started out with. Okay, so a little picture to kind of illustrate what I mean by this. And I was in Australia a few years back, and that's why I have to tell you that, because that phone number will not work in Oregon or wherever you're calling in from. But on my way to the school, I saw this sign, and it was at night, and it said graffiti hotline. And when I looked around, I noticed that all the walls and the fences and so forth all had graffiti on them. And so the neighborhood got together and they put up this sign as an intervention to solve the problem. And if you look carefully, what happened is that, of course, some kids came along and saw an empty canvas, the sign, and put graffiti on it. And I want to argue that that's a mismatch between the problem and the intervention. And what I mean by that is that they had this problem of graffiti writing. They put up a sign to try to inhibit that graffiti writing. And all it actually did is serve as an empty canvas for those kids to actually put more graffiti on it. Now, you could argue that it is going to inhibit graffiti writing in those kids who are thinking about it, or those kids who might have dabbled in it. But for the chronic graffiti writers, that has no effect. And for the kids who've been repeatedly doing graffiti on those walls and those fences around the neighborhood, no effect at all. So why is this picture important? Well, it kind of illustrates one of the problems we have inside our schools. And every school that I've ever worked in has had some kind of code of discipline, code of conduct, discipline handbook, behavior handbook, some set of guidelines for how to handle rule violations. And, it's that 34-page document that has every kind of possible problem behavior with a consequence lined up with it as a way of responding. And what do? We put in place an intervention called the discipline handbook, and we use that to try to solve all the problems. And of course, there are those kids out there who are chronically involved in problem behavior. And that discipline handbook has no effect on their behavior. In fact, the discipline handbook serves as another opportunity for arguing, for conflict, for disagreement, for disobedience, and so forth. And so I want to argue, again, we have this mismatch between the school-wide discipline system and for those kids who might have chronic or intensive challenging behaviors. That kind of logic of a mismatch between a general intervention to a high intensity problem led us into this notion of the tiered logic. And I set you up for that on purpose because I wanted you to understand that the tiered logic is not something that we invented but instead came out of the prevention logic. That work that Tony Bigland, the work out of the Center for Disease Control, the work that Walker did, basically said you can't build a PBIS center and just do individualized interventions. What you have to be able to do is understand how those individualized interventions fit into the context of classrooms, schools, institutions, group homes, community, and so forth. So that's where the three-tiered logic came from. It's a logic because it's just a way of thinking. And what it basically says is all kids need to have the best possible set of interventions and supports, school-wide, classroom-wide. Some kids are going to need a little extra, and some kids are going to need high-intensity support. I know some of you on this call deliver Tier 3 supports or tertiary prevention supports, but you will also have a responsibility for giving supports to all kids, because if all kids are being supported, then our individual kids are more likely to be successful. There are hundreds, literally hundreds of different variations of triangles out there, but they all have the same basic features, and that is it's something for all, it's targeted interventions for groups, and it's individualized intensive interventions for a few kids who have individualized supports. And the all is important because if you put all in place, then you can decrease the number of kids who require those more targeted or intensive interventions, which is sort of our logic at the PBI Center. I want you to remember that the triangle does not label kids. We do not label kids as Tier 3, or he's a Tier 2 student, or that's Tier 3 George. Instead, we label what they do, and we label the interventions. Here's a picture of a student named Theora. She's not in special ed, she's not on a 504 plan, she doesn't have a disability, but she has two areas where she's getting Tier 3 supports: individualized math and science tutoring. She gets small group support, Spanish and writing, and there are other areas at the bottom of the triangle where she gets no supports at all except through the general curriculum. She's not a Tier 3 kid, she's not a Tier 1 kid. She has intensive needs and she has some universal supports. Here's a kid on an IEP, and on his IEP he has two objectives. One is anger management, problem solving, where he receives Tier 3 supports, but he also has all these other areas that he does really well in. And those are areas that he can benefit from the general curriculum. Because he's in special ed, is he a Tier 3 student? The answer is no, because he's receiving Tier 3 support for two areas that are part of his disability. He's not a Tier 3 kid. Special ed is not a Tier 3 intervention. Tier 3 special ed is a system in place to deliver Tier 3 supports, but special ed actually supports all levels within the tiered logic. Pass that by. One of your homework assignments is to do one of these on yourself, because what we find is that all of us have areas for which we need to work on, and some areas for which we need to, where we don't need a lot of help. I know some of us don't like to be called the F word by some of our kids or clients, and sometimes we accelerate or escalate when that happens. We oftentimes need our own support in being able to diffuse or calm ourselves down. And for others of us, that diffusing process is really easy. We don't need a lot of support. So I think it's pretty important to kind of think through, what this means. It also kind of communicates the message that we don't want to take behavior personally, that the behaviors have a function and their role is to communicate something, and what our goal really is how to establish interventions that match up to the intensity of the problems that are being presented. Now, I want you to pay attention to this picture because it took me a long time to make the PowerPoint do this. So, but I want you to kind of look at what we mean by this logic. It starts off with three tiers, and that's what we mean by logic. Truth of the matter is, it's a continuum. There's all kinds of variations on how it looks. We make sure that we think about kid outcomes within the context of that triangle. We think about classroom management in the same way. My wife used to be a school principal, and all her classrooms had a continuum of support for classroom management. So if I was a classroom teacher in 4th grade, 9th grade, whatever, here's what I might rely upon in my toolbox for classroom management. And then the school-wide system has its continuum of support. So it's not just using the discipline handbook, it's using a whole set of strategies across the school that we as therapists, counselors, school psychologists, and others might deliver. Successful school climates, successful school classrooms have a continuum of practices in place in the classroom and a continuum set of practices at the school-wide level. And many of us on this call were actually involved in delivering some of those interventions. across the different environments and across individual kids. So again, the triangle is not there to label kids. It's there to organize the interventions and how we interpret the problem. We're also doing work now at the district level, where their initiatives and priorities and professional development decisions are being made across that continuum as well. So here's one more variation just to kind of give you a picture of how this works. These are going back to where we started with the outcomes, data, practices, and systems logic that I showed you right at the very beginning. To realize what we mean by this is that as you go up the triangle in the bigger picture, you have to intensify the individualization of the outcomes. You have to intensify the data collecting. You have to have more individualized interventions that are more intensive, and you have to have supports for the adults, especially at the team level, in order to pull this off. I'm going to show you one more picture, then I'm going to stop and see if you have any questions, and I'm going to do a little bit more towards the end. So if you have questions, please throw them on the chat, and well, we'll just kind of check to see how people are doing. Another variation of the logic, just to kind of illustrate what we mean by tier 3. And I want you to kind of look at this picture because it illustrates that each of those little triangles at the top up there is a kid, and that kid has tier 3 things that they're good at, but they have these individual needs that they're kind of focusing on. And all these represent different individual students who have a different individualized intensive intervention in place to meet their needs. But they're still being supported by these small group and school-wide systems that are in place. So yes, they're getting individualized systems, but they're also integrated into a larger continuum. So taking this a little further, you might be in a school where the 3 core values are respect, responsibility, and safety, or their vision, if you will, for all kids. And they might have small group supports in place, counseling sessions or whatever, or in-class morning meetings where self-management, cooperative play, stress management, or whatever is in place. And these individual kids have individualized plans that focuses on their individual needs. And again, the idea here is to think about the interventions that are put in place to match up against the needs of the students, against the continuum of supports that are in place. So I like this particular picture again because it individualizes the tier 3 supports and it visually provides that example. Also illustrates that there are small group interventions in place for groups of kids and that there are school-wide supports in place that can support the bigger, the tier 2 and tier 3 systems. Okay, so let me stop there and ask if you have any questions. So I take that as no questions, so I'm going to move on. Is that correct, Melissa, Amanda?
Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions here.
Okay, so let me move forward then. I just got 2 more things I'm going to do, and then I'm going to stop. One is to kind of suggest to you that PBIS is something that's been around for a while. Something new that's popping up in schools is MTSS, which is multi-tiered systems. And I want you to note that multi-tiered systems and PBIS share a number of functions, and that's all those things around the outside. I'm not going to go through them. They're things we've sort of covered already. But I want you to understand that if a school that you're working with or you're in is calling themselves a PBIS school, they're also doing MTSS for behavior, and that there's not a whole lot of differences between the 2 continuum or continua, but in fact that they're representing the same basic logic, just as sort of a different focus on what the attention is focused on. All right, I'm going to leave you with one more homework assignment. I'm going to do it in the context of summarizing a study, and then I'm going to close with some concluding comments, and then I'll go away for dinner, and you guys can go away for your afternoon tea or coffee. I just want to share with you one really cool study, and it came out last year, and it's one of my favorite recent ones, lots of favorite ones, but this is one of my more favorite ones. And this is going to be a homework assignment for you to think about how you would use it on Monday. Clayton Cook and his colleagues at the University of Minnesota did this great study that was published in JPBI, Journal of Positive Behavior Interventions. And in this particular study, they looked at something called positive greetings at the door. And basically what they did is they taught teachers or worked with teachers and taught them how to give a greeting at the classroom door. And they found that teachers who delivered positive greetings had students who had shorter latencies for getting on task faster upon entering the room, greater academic engagement. So before the positive greetings at the door, compared to after, there was an increase in academic engagement. So just greeting kids at the door had an effect of increasing academic engagement, but also had the effect of decreasing disruptive behavior. So the bottom line here is that if I'm a classroom teacher and there are 30 kids entering my room, I greet them at the door, there's an increased likelihood that most of those kids will get on task faster and that they'll have fewer disruptive behavior. This is a very cool tier 1 intervention that can be applied at the classroom level. Now, what does the positive greeting look like? You got to personalize it. You got to make sure that you give a little reminder, that's a positive statement about what to do next, and then a reinforcer. So it'd be something like, good morning, Amanda. Good to see you. Handshake. I really like your backpack. Beautiful backpack. Please hang it up on the hanger before you sit down and get started. So I've given a personal greeting. I've given a reminder about what to do with the backpack. I've given a positive statement about how nice the backpack was. Give all 3 of those to the kids for each one that comes in. You're going to individualize. You're going to make contact with some kids, no contact with others. You're going to use different kind of language that's more public and private, depending on the student. And you're going to give them sort of individualized corrections based on who they are. Some kids might come in a little bit excited, and you might want to slow them down a little bit and have them stand next to you. And you can deliver a tier 2 supports to slow them down. So you're giving them a little bit extra. It's an easy way to deliver a check-in with those kids before they sit down. I love this intervention because it's a simple way of focusing on what the school-wide rules might be, as well as making contact with every single kid. If you go way back to the beginning of this webinar, I mentioned to you that academic engagement, school engagement and adult relationships are a big deal around school safety and school success. This is an easy way to make sure every kid has contact. And some of the kids walking in the door, like Melissa, you might have to give them 2 fist bumps because some kids need a little extra. And that's, again, using that continuum logic as you move through this content. So when do you use this? Every transition. You know, you might start off with it every day and then fade out as you go through the school year, bring it back after breaks. But the idea is to increase the amount of contacts you have with kids. So your homework assignment is, how would you do that in your setting with kids? If you're a principal on this call, how would you do it with your staff? If you're a school counselor, how would you do this when kids are moving down your hallway? If you're working in a family setting, how would you do this when family members enter? Think about Walmart. You know, you've got greeters there. How could we become greeters in our classrooms and our schools? All right, let me pass this by just because of time. So I want to finish with the big ideas. And I'll do this very quickly in the last minute and a half that I have. And my focus here was clearly on prevention. And I gave you some thoughts about how PBIS kind of reflects that prevention-based logic and why schools are such an important place to invest. I focused on this idea that the behavioral sciences, which is sort of my world, is a useful conceptual framework to be able to deliver these interventions. And that in my world, again, you know, thinking about how we organize these environments for kids' success. 3, it's really important that in addition to prevention and use of behavioral sciences, that we use the best interventions that money can buy, and that we're clear that we can defend those interventions as being empirically supported. 4th, that those interventions are only as good as the supports available to the adults who have to implement those interventions. So it becomes really important for the adults, which is where I spend most of my work, that the adults receive the support so they can deliver those interventions effectively, efficiently, in a durable manner. 5th, all the previous 4 big ideas are dependent upon the data that we use to guide decisions. The data become even more important as you move up the triangle and the intensity of the problem, because then you have to be much more individualized in your assessments, which many of you are already familiar with if you work with kids with disabilities and other challenges. But it really is a data problem that we need to depend upon. In the real world, we take our blood pressure on a regular basis to see how we're doing, sort of tier 1-ish. But if our medical condition isn't adequate, we sometimes move to taking our blood pressure every week. So the data collection system has to be accommodating the level of intensity of the problem. To me, dealing with problem behavior is really a teaching problem, and that is, how do we teach better ways of behaving? Kids come in with a lot of different challenging behavior for a lot of different reasons, and most kids can learn different ways of behaving as a way to get their needs met, as a way to handle the frustrations and attention that they need to receive, or to get away from some things that they don't like. The teaching is a very important big idea from the PBIS perspective. One last picture I need to show you, just to kind of give you a context for why this is a big deal. And I'll just assume you're answering the question, but when you see this picture, most of us identify with which door to go into. We know, for myself, for example, I would go in the left door. When we're walking down the hallway, we know which direction to go. You have to go to the bathroom. For my case, I would go to the left. Most of us know, after a little bit of studying, know which direction to go in and looking at this picture. In some ways, there's some conflicting messages going on in this particular picture. The last picture, though, shows one that's even more difficult to decide which room you go into. And the reason I like this picture is because in this particular setting, which is a bar in Colorado, they've set it up so that you have to figure out which door to go into by the messages on the door. So if you look at the right-hand door, it says men with a finger pointing to the left-hand door, and it says women on the left-hand door with a hand pointing to the right-hand door. And the question becomes one of which door do you go into? The short way of thinking about this is if you've had no drinks, how do you figure it out? You watch to see how other people do it, or you ask for what the rule is for using the bathroom. If you've had 2 to 5 drinks, you peek inside the door for any kind of sign to figure out which door to go into. And if you've had 6 or more drinks, what do? You just go in anyway, because it really doesn't matter which door you go into, right? You're going to get it right half the time, and the other half, it doesn't really matter. So why do I care about this? Because a lot of our kids walk into school environments not being able to interpret the signals, the messages, the symbols of the school, especially the social cues. And we need to be much more explicit about teaching. So in this case, the truth is, men is on the left-hand side, and women is on the right-hand side. You got to follow the pointed hand. And even when I tell you this, some people hesitate, but the answer is men's on the left, women's on the right. And if there are opportunities for learning this rule, then we need to make sure we teach explicitly to kids what the right way is. All right, so last big idea, culture is a big idea. It's really important to remember that if you got firewood, it's not how far the wood is, it's that you have wood for sale. And it really is about trying to create equitable environments to make sure that we take our learning histories into consideration whenever we make decisions about problem behavior. Many resources out there for you. So if you've got the handout, you can pull up some of these that I use to kind of build this presentation. And it'll probably provide you a way to kind of address some of your individual needs. There are a number of kind of what we call research briefs and technical briefs available at the PBIS site if there's some questions you have around bullying or family engagement or school-based behavior, mental health, and so forth. And if you're interested in some of the issues around disability, I've been recently involved in some issues around restraint and seclusion, and we've been working pretty hard on the Keeping All Students Safe Act. If you're interested in some of the policy work that's out there, you might take a look at that material. And if you have a position around gun violence in our schools and our communities, there's also some work that we've been working on to try to build in some policies to try to address some of the gun violence that's out there. So I leave those for you to kind of look at on your own. And here's some things to do to call in sick on some of these dates, some of the events that are happening around the PBIS world, some around the Northeast, as well as Florida, Chicago, and what have you. And then I'll leave you with this picture with some contact information, emails for how to get a hold of me, or you can go to Amanda or Melissa or the Siebert site, and they will be happy to respond, or you can go to the PBIS.org site. So I apologize to Amanda and Melissa for going over, but I'll stop now. And I don't know if you want to ask for questions again, or if we should just close out.
Hey, George, thank you so much for that. That was a wonderful webinar. I think given time, we probably should close it up. If anyone does have any other follow-up questions, though, you're more than welcome to email me or Matt or Melissa, and we would be happy to forward any of those questions on to George. Thank you all so much for your time.